When did nursing home families have to install hidden cameras because staff reports of abuse were ignored? The bruise on my father's cheek appeared on a Wednesday in March. I noticed it during my weekly visit to Riverside Manor when I leaned down to hug him and saw the purple discoloration spreading from his cheekbone to his jawline. Dad was 82 with advanced Alzheimer's and couldn't explain what had happened. He just touched his face and winced when I asked about it. I found his nurse, a woman named Beverly who'd worked at Riverside for 15 years. She glanced at Dad's bruise and said he'd fallen getting out of bed 2 nights ago. She showed me an incident report documenting the fall at 11:30 on Monday evening. The report said staff had responded immediately, assessed him for injury, found minor bruising, and monitored him overnight. Everything seemed properly documented. But something felt wrong. Dad had been bedridden for 3 months. His legs were too weak to support his weight. He couldn't get out of bed without mechanical assistance. The incident report claimed he'd tried to stand independently and fallen, but that was impossible given his physical condition. I asked Beverly how a man who couldn't walk had managed to fall out of bed. She said confused patients sometimes tried things beyond their capabilities and that the staff did their best to prevent falls but couldn't watch everyone every second. Her tone suggested I was being difficult by asking questions. I let it go that day, but took photos of the bruise with my phone. Something about Beverly's explanation didn't add up. The next week, I visited on a different day, hoping to catch the facility at a less prepared moment. Dad had a new bruise on his forearm, dark purple with yellowing edges, suggesting it was several days old. This one looked like finger marks. Someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave distinct impressions. I found the charge nurse, a man named Dennis, who'd been there 8 years. He pulled up Dad's chart and showed me another incident report. This one claimed Dad had been agitated during a diaper change, and the aide had needed to restrain him gently to prevent him from falling off the changing table. The bruise was documented as accidental from the restraint. Dennis explained that dementia patients often became combative during personal care, and staff had to use physical management techniques for everyone's safety. Again, the explanation seemed plausible on the surface. But I'd been visiting Dad 3 times a week for the 6 months he'd been at Riverside, and I'd never seen him combative. He was docile, confused, mostly nonverbal. The idea that he'd fought hard enough to require forceful restraint didn't match his behavior. I asked Dennis if I could review the security camera footage from the incident. He said the cameras in resident rooms weren't operational due to privacy concerns, and that hallway cameras had limited angles. There was no footage of the actual incident, just the documentation from staff. I started visiting at random times. Early morning before breakfast, late evening after dinner, weekend afternoons. Every visit I documented Dad's condition with photos and notes. Over the next month, I found 3 more bruises in various stages of healing. A mark on his shoulder, scrapes on both knees, a cut above his eyebrow that required butterfly bandages. Each injury had an incident report explaining it as an accidental fall or the result of Dad's confusion. The facility administrator, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, agreed to meet with me after I'd filed my 4th formal complaint. She sat across from her desk in a tastefully decorated office and assured me that resident safety was Riverside's top priority. She said they took all concerns seriously and had reviewed every incident involving my father. According to her investigation, all injuries were properly documented, all staff had followed protocol, and there was no evidence of neglect or abuse. She suggested that families of dementia patients often struggled to accept how physically vulnerable their loved ones became, and that seeing injuries was emotionally difficult, but not necessarily indicative of poor care. Patricia's tone was sympathetic but firm. She made me feel like an overreacting son, rather than someone raising legitimate safety concerns. I contacted the state ombudsman whose office was supposed to investigate nursing home complaints. I filed a detailed report including photos of Dad's injuries, copies of incident reports, and my concerns about the inconsistencies in the explanations. The ombudsman assigned to our case was named Gerald Stokes. He visited Riverside 2 weeks later and conducted what he called a thorough investigation. He interviewed staff, reviewed documentation, and observed care practices. His report concluded that Riverside Manor was in compliance with all state regulations, and that there was insufficient evidence to support allegations of abuse or neglect. Gerald noted that elderly residents with dementia were prone to falls and injuries, that all incidents had been properly documented, and that the facility had appropriate policies in place. He recommended I work with the facility to address my concerns, rather than pursuing further investigation. The system had reviewed my complaints and determined they were unfounded. I was supposed to accept that and move on, but I couldn't. The injuries kept appearing. Dad started flinching when certain staff members approached him. He'd never done that before. His eyes would widen with what looked like fear, and he'd try to pull away even though he couldn't articulate why. I noticed he flinched most around a night shift aide named Craig Denning and around Beverly, the nurse I'd first spoken to about the bruises. My sister Lauren flew in from Seattle after I called her about the situation. She was an attorney specializing in elder law and had handled nursing home abuse cases before. She visited Riverside with me and immediately noticed things I'd been too close to see clearly. The way staff delayed responding when Dad's call button rang. How they spoke about him in third person even when he was right there. The rough manner in which they moved him during transfers. Lauren observed for 3 hours and documented everything. Afterward, she said Dad was definitely being mistreated and that the pattern of injuries plus the facility's dismissive response to complaints was textbook institutional abuse. She explained that nursing homes often had cultures where abuse was normalized, where staff felt entitled to be rough with difficult patients, where management protected employees rather than residents. She said the state oversight system was notoriously weak because facilities had powerful lobbying groups and regulators were overworked and underfunded. Most abuse cases only came to light when someone died or when families obtained video evidence that couldn't be dismissed. Lauren suggested installing a hidden camera in Dad's room. It was legal in our state as long as one party consented, and since I had power of attorney for Dad, I could consent on his behalf. The camera had to be hidden, because if staff knew about it, they'd alter their behavior. We needed to catch them in the act, doing whatever they were doing when they thought no one was watching. I felt sick about needing to do this, about having to spy on the people I was paying $2,800 a month to care for my father. But I also knew Lauren was right. Without video evidence, the complaints would continue to be dismissed. We bought a camera designed to look like a digital clock. It had a wide-angle lens hidden in the display and could record continuously for 72 hours before the memory card needed to be swapped. I placed it on Dad's bedside table, angled to capture most of the room, including the bed and the doorway. I told no one at Riverside about the camera. Just set it up during a regular visit and activated it before I left. The first footage I reviewed was mostly routine. Staff coming in to check vitals, deliver meals, change diapers. Everything looked normal, if somewhat rushed and impersonal. Then on the third night, I found it. Craig Denning entered Dad's room at 2:17 in the morning. Dad was asleep. Craig roughly shook him awake, then yanked the blankets off the bed. Dad made a confused sound and tried to curl into a ball. Craig grabbed Dad's arm and jerked him into a sitting position hard enough that Dad's head snapped back. "Time to change you," Craig said, his voice cold and annoyed. "Quit being difficult." Dad wasn't being difficult. He was disoriented and scared. Craig pulled Dad's arms above his head and stripped his shirt off aggressively, then shoved him backward onto the bed so hard Dad's head bounced off the pillow. During the diaper change, Craig handled Dad roughly, yanking his legs apart, making no effort to be gentle. When Dad made a sound of distress, Craig told him to shut up. "Nobody wants to hear your noise, old man. You should have died already and saved everyone the trouble." The casual cruelty in Craig's voice made my hands shake. This was how my father was being treated when I wasn't there. This was what happened in the dark hours when families were home sleeping. I kept watching. Beverly came in at 3:40 to give Dad his medication. She pulled him into a sitting position by grabbing his arm and twisting it in a way that made Dad cry out. "Stop whining," she said. "You're not hurt." She shoved pills into his mouth and forced water down his throat without waiting to see if he could swallow. Dad choked and water ran down his chin. Beverly didn't wipe it up, just let it soak into his shirt. She dropped him back onto the bed and left, without checking if he was okay. I had video of 2 staff members abusing my father within hours of each other. This wasn't isolated incidents or accidents. This was systematic mistreatment by people who'd been doing it so long they didn't even try to hide it from each other. I spent the rest of the night reviewing 72 hours of footage. I found dozens of instances of rough handling, verbal abuse, neglect of call buttons, staff complaining about residents in their hearing, medication errors, and what looked like deliberate intimidation. Craig was the worst, but Beverly was close behind. Other staff members weren't actively abusive, but they ignored what was happening. They heard Craig being cruel and said nothing. They saw Beverly being rough and didn't report it. The culture of abuse was so normalized that everyone participated through action or inaction. I called Lauren at 6 in the morning. She came to my house immediately and we watched the footage together. Her expression went from shock to fury to grim determination. "This is criminal assault and elder abuse. We need to take this to the police immediately." We made copies of the most damaging clips and drove to the police station. The desk sergeant directed us to Detective Amanda Berkshire, who handled elder abuse cases. She watched the footage in silence. When it ended, she looked at me. "How long has this been going on?" I told her about the bruises, the incident reports, the complaints to the facility and the ombudsman, the dismissals and excuses. Detective Berkshire's jaw tightened. "The facility knew. Management had to know if you'd filed multiple complaints. They investigated and found nothing because they didn't want to find anything. This is institutional abuse with administrative cover-up." She said she'd open a criminal investigation immediately and would coordinate with the state attorney general's office for potential civil charges. She warned me that removing Dad from the facility right now might complicate the investigation because they needed to preserve evidence. I told her Dad wasn't spending another night there. We'd move him today. She nodded and said she understood, but to document everything before we moved him. Lauren and I went directly to Riverside. I walked into Patricia Holbrook's office without knocking. She looked up from her computer, startled. "I need to speak with you about my father." She gestured to a chair, but I remained standing. "I have video evidence of your staff physically abusing my father. Rough handling, verbal abuse, neglect, medication errors. Multiple staff members over multiple days. I've already given the footage to the police, who are opening a criminal investigation. I'm removing my father from this facility immediately." Patricia's face went white. "Video evidence? You can't record in our facility without permission. That's a violation of our privacy policy." I pulled out my phone and showed her a clip of Craig, shoving Dad roughly onto the bed. I have power of attorney and consented on my father's behalf. It's completely legal, and your privacy policy doesn't protect staff from prosecution for abuse. Patricia stood abruptly. I need to see all the footage before you remove your father. We need to conduct our own investigation. Lauren stepped forward. There won't be an internal investigation covering this up. The police are handling it. We're here to collect my father's belongings and transfer him to another facility. You can cooperate or we can have the police escort us, but either way, he's leaving today. Patricia called her lawyer while Lauren and I went to Dad's room. Beverly was there checking his vitals. She saw my face and knew immediately something was wrong. Is there a problem? I asked her how long she'd been abusing my father. Her expression shifted from confusion to defensive anger. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never abused anyone. Your father is confused and combative, and we do our best with him. I played the clip of her roughly medicating Dad and forcing water down his throat while he choked. Beverly's face went pale. That's taken out of context. You don't understand how difficult dementia patients can be. Lauren cut her off. That's assault. The police will be here shortly to interview you. I suggest you get your own lawyer. Beverly left without another word. We packed Dad's belongings while he watched from his bed, looking confused and frightened. I sat beside him and took his hand. We're taking you somewhere safe, Dad. No one's going to hurt you anymore. His eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed my hand. He might not understand everything, but he understood. We were protecting him. The police arrived an hour later with a warrant. They sealed Dad's room as a crime scene and began interviewing staff. Detective Berkshire pulled me aside. We're arresting Craig Denning and Beverly Knowles today. There may be additional arrests as the investigation continues. We transferred Dad to a different facility across town that had better reviews and more rigorous oversight. The director, a man, Raymond Kowal, was horrified when I explained what had happened. He assured me his facility had zero tolerance for abuse, that they had cameras in common areas, that staff were extensively trained and supervised. I told him I'd be installing my own camera in Dad's room regardless, and he said he understood completely. The story broke in local news that evening. Nursing home staff arrested for elder abuse after family installs hidden camera. The footage went viral online with millions of views within days. People were outraged, the comments section filled with similar stories from families who'd suspected abuse but couldn't prove it, who'd been dismissed by facility administrators and state regulators, who'd watched their loved ones decline and wondered if mistreatment was the cause. The collective anger was massive and sustained. The state attorney general announced a comprehensive investigation into Riverside Manor and other facilities in the network. They subpoenaed records, interviewed former employees, and reviewed complaints that had been dismissed. The investigation revealed systemic problems. Riverside had received 87 abuse complaints over 3 years and had found merit in 0 cases. Every single complaint had been dismissed as family overreaction or resident confusion. The pattern was undeniable. Craig Denning was charged with 6 counts of assault, 3 counts of elder abuse, and 1 count of terroristic threats for telling Dad he should die. Police found complaints in his personnel file from previous facilities where he'd worked. He'd been fired twice for rough handling, but Riverside had hired him anyway without adequate background checks. Beverly Knowles was charged with 4 counts of assault and 2 counts of elder abuse. She'd worked at Riverside for 15 years, and multiple families had complained about her rough treatment of residents. All complaints had been investigated internally and dismissed. Patricia Holbrook was charged with criminal negligence and obstruction of justice for repeatedly dismissing credible complaints without proper investigation. Her emails revealed she'd been warned by staff about Craig's behavior multiple times and had chosen to ignore it. The corporate owners of Riverside were named in a massive civil lawsuit. 18 families joined the class action after reviewing the investigation findings and realizing their loved ones had likely suffered similar abuse. Medical experts reviewed photos and records and found patterns consistent with systematic mistreatment. Residents who'd been documented as falling repeatedly showed injuries more consistent with assault. Medication errors that had been blamed on resident confusion were actually staff negligence. The corporate response was to deny everything and blame individual bad actors rather than acknowledging systemic failures. The trial for Craig and Beverly happened 8 months later. I testified about finding the bruises, about filing complaints that were dismissed, about installing the camera as a last resort. The jury watched the footage of Craig verbally abusing Dad and roughly handling him during care. They saw Beverly forcing medication and leaving Dad choking. They heard Craig tell my father he should have died already. Several jurors were crying by the end of the video evidence. The defense tried arguing that dementia patients required firm handling and that what looked like abuse was actually necessary care management. They brought in an expert who testified about the challenges of caring for combative residents. But the prosecutor destroyed that argument by pointing out that Dad wasn't combative in the footage. He was passive and frightened. The force Craig used wasn't necessary or appropriate. It was cruelty. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all counts for both defendants. Craig was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Beverly got 2 years. Patricia Holbrook pleaded guilty to criminal negligence and received 18 months plus 5 years probation. The corporate owners settled the civil lawsuit for $8.7 million, distributed among the 18 families. They also agreed to implement comprehensive reforms, including mandatory cameras in resident rooms, independent review of abuse complaints, and enhanced staff training. But they admitted no wrongdoing, which meant they could continue operating other facilities. Dad lived for another year after we moved him to the new facility. His care was gentle and respectful. Staff spoke to him kindly. No unexplained bruises appeared. He seemed calmer, less frightened. I visited every day and never saw anything concerning. The hidden camera I'd installed captured only appropriate care. When Dad died of pneumonia at age 83, I had the comfort of knowing his last year had been peaceful and safe. The funeral was quiet and small. Afterward, Raymond Cowell approached me. "Your father's case changed everything in this industry. Because of what you exposed, 3 states have passed laws requiring cameras in nursing home rooms. Federal regulations have been strengthened. Families have tools now to protect their loved ones." He was right, but it felt hollow. Dad shouldn't have needed me to install a hidden camera to be safe. The system should have protected him when I first reported the bruises. Instead, the system had protected the abusers, and I'd had to become a vigilante to get justice. That was the real failure. Not that abuse happened, but that complaints were systematically dismissed, that families were told they were overreacting, that institutions prioritized reputation over resident safety. A year after Dad's death, I started a nonprofit called Elder Shield. We provided free hidden cameras to families who suspected nursing home abuse. We taught them how to document injuries, how to file effective complaints, how to navigate the legal system. We connected them with attorneys specializing in elder law. We shared their stories to keep pressure on regulators and legislators. The work was emotionally exhausting. Every week I talked to families who'd discovered their loved ones were being abused, who'd complained and been dismissed, who felt helpless and betrayed by systems meant to protect vulnerable people. Some stories ended with justice like ours had. Others ended with residents dying before anyone could help them. The scope of the problem was overwhelming. Elder Shield provided cameras to over 300 families in the first year. 60% of them captured footage of abuse or neglect. Some cases were as severe as what happened to Dad. Others showed less dramatic but equally harmful neglect. Staff ignoring call buttons for hours, leaving residents lying in soiled diapers. Meals being withheld as punishment. Medication being skipped to save time. Residents being mocked or belittled. The footage revealed that mistreatment of vulnerable elderly people was widespread and normalized. The facilities we investigated weren't outliers. They were typical. The abuse wasn't limited to a few bad employees. It was cultural and institutional. Several facilities sued us, claiming we were engaging in illegal surveillance and defamation. We won every case. The courts ruled that families had the right to monitor their loved ones' care and that exposing abuse was protected speech. The lawsuits actually helped us because they generated publicity and donations. More families contacted us asking for cameras. More whistleblowers came forward with stories about facilities where abuse was common and complaints were buried. The state legislature held hearings about nursing home oversight. I testified along with other families and former employees. I showed legislators the footage from Dad's case and explained how many times I'd reported abuse before resorting to the camera. I described how the ombudsman had dismissed my complaints as unfounded despite photographic evidence of injuries. I explained that the system wasn't just failing to protect residents, but was actively enabling abuse through inadequate oversight and reflexive defense of institutions over individuals. One legislator asked why families needed hidden cameras if the ombudsman system was working as intended. I told him the ombudsman system wasn't working, that it was understaffed, underfunded, and captured by the industry it was supposed to regulate, that ombudsmen were more likely to side with facilities than families, that Gerald Stokes had spent 2 hours at Riverside and concluded everything was fine while my camera captured hours of abuse in a single weekend. The legislature passed several reforms: mandatory cameras in all resident rooms, independent investigations of abuse complaints, increased funding for ombudsman programs, criminal penalties for administrators who dismissed credible complaints. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were progress. Other states began copying our laws. The federal government updated Medicare, regulations to require better monitoring. The changes happened because families like mine refused to stay silent, because we had video evidence that couldn't be dismissed, because we made the problem too visible to ignore. Craig Denning was released from prison after serving 3 years. He immediately moved to another state and tried getting a job at a different nursing home. The facility ran a background check and found his convictions. He was denied. The National Registry of Abusive Caregivers that hadn't existed when he'd worked at Riverside now flagged him permanently. He'd never work in healthcare again. Beverly Knowles served 18 months and was also permanently barred from caregiving positions. She filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying her share of the civil judgment. Patricia Holbrook's career in healthcare administration was over. No facility would hire her after the criminal conviction. She worked retail management now and lived in a different state. The corporate owners of Riverside sold their nursing home chain to another company that promised reforms, but many of the same systemic problems continued under different branding. 5 years after Dad's death, Elder Shield had provided cameras to over 1,500 families. We'd documented abuse in nearly 1,000 cases. We'd helped secure criminal convictions in 37 cases and civil settlements totaling over $50 million. We'd trained thousands of families on recognizing signs of abuse and navigating complaint systems. We'd become the resource families turned to when official channels failed them. The work was satisfying but also heartbreaking. Every case represented someone's loved one suffering while institutions looked away. I received an email from a woman named Dorothy Inglewood, whose father was in a nursing home in another state. She'd installed one of our cameras after noticing unexplained bruises and had captured footage of a nurse's aide hitting her father during a diaper change. She'd filed a police report and contacted state regulators. Both had dismissed her complaint as unfounded. The facility claimed the footage was edited or staged. The nurse's aide claimed the man had struck her first and she was defending herself. The investigator had accepted that explanation without interviewing other witnesses or checking for prior complaints. Dorothy was desperate for help. I called her and talked through the situation. The footage clearly showed the aide hitting her father unprovoked. It wasn't self-defense, but the system was protecting the facility again. I connected Dorothy with Lauren, who'd continued practicing elder law and had developed expertise in these cases. Lauren reviewed the footage and agreed to represent Dorothy pro bono. She filed a federal lawsuit arguing that the state's failure to properly investigate constituted civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The case drew national attention and eventually resulted in the aide being criminally charged and the facility being fined. But it took 2 years of fighting, and Dorothy's father died before seeing justice. Stories like Dorothy's reinforced why the work mattered. The system was still failing families. Reforms had helped, but weren't enough. Too many facilities still prioritized profit over care. Too many regulators still sided with institutions over individuals. Too many abusers still faced minimal consequences. The hidden cameras were a band-aid on a system that needed fundamental restructuring. But until that restructuring happened, families needed tools to protect their loved ones. At Elder Shield's 5-year anniversary gala, we honored families who'd exposed abuse and advocates who'd fought for reform. Lauren gave a speech about how Dad's case had sparked a movement, how individual families taking action had created systemic change, how refusing to accept dismissive responses from authorities had saved lives. She thanked me for having the courage to install that camera, for refusing to accept the gaslighting, for fighting when fighting was exhausting. I thought about Dad during that speech, about the bruises I'd documented, about the complaints I'd filed that were ignored, about installing that camera and watching footage that broke my heart, about the year he'd spent being abused by people paid to care for him, about the peaceful final year he'd had at the new facility. The system had failed him catastrophically, but we'd fought back and created change that protected other people's fathers and mothers. That had to mean something. 10 years after Dad's death, Elder Shield had helped over 5,000 families and documented abuse in 3,000 cases. The work continued because the problem continued, but fewer families faced the dismissive responses I'd gotten. More regulators took complaints seriously. More facilities had cameras and oversight. More abusers faced consequences. The culture was shifting slowly toward believing families and protecting residents. Raymond Cowell retired and personally thanked me for changing an industry that had been broken for decades. Gerald Stokes, the ombudsman who dismissed my complaints, also retired, but reached out to apologize, saying he'd been trained to trust facilities over families and wished he'd investigated more thoroughly. Patricia Holbrook sent a letter from prison acknowledging she'd failed Dad and countless other residents by prioritizing the facility's reputation over their safety. The apologies felt inadequate but sincere. The hidden camera sat in my office now, a small digital clock that had exposed massive institutional rot. Families still contacted us daily, asking for cameras, asking for help, asking how to protect their loved ones from the same fate Dad had suffered. We helped everyone we could, knowing each case represented someone who shouldn't have needed to spy on caregivers to ensure basic safety, someone let down by systems meant to protect them. The fight for dignity and safety in nursing homes wasn't won, but it was better than before, and that progress came from families refusing to accept that abuse was inevitable, from video evidence that made denial impossible, from collective action that forced change institutions resisted. Dad's suffering had sparked something that helped thousands, and though that couldn't undo what happened to him, it honored his memory in a way that mattered. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.